Each part of JoJo is unique in one way or another, with the major element that separates them being the lead JoJo of the part, as Araki tends to give each of them their own personal bookend, and because of this, all of them have different conclusions, though some of them made it out of their adventures more worse for wear than others, and some never even saw their adventure come to its conclusion. So like in my video where I looked at who got it the worst out of all of JoJo's villains, I thought it'd be fun to figure out which JoJo made it out the best. So before we start, obviously there will be spoilers in this video, since we're discussing the end of characters' stories. Now, in order to make this an accurate assessment of each of the JoJo's endings, we should factor in everything that led up to that point, because not all the deaths in the series are equal in severity, especially when we look at the lives that the characters had lived up to that point. Along with this, I'm also taking into account the things that occurred post their death, because that's just as important as when they were alive. So let's begin this with the most unfortunate Joestar, someone whose life was a constant struggle to survive and maintain their own form of identity, that being the hostile, hospitalized horse jockey, Johnny Joestar. Now, Johnny grew up in a strict household and lived in the constant shadow of his brother up to the point of his brother's death. From then, his father refused to recognize him as his own person. Eventually, this drove Johnny to become an egocentric asshole who took advantage of his talents to get what he wanted in the world, though his actions resulted in him being shot and crippled, ending his career and deflating his own identity. Though he was able to eventually overcome this disability, but it was at the cost of his best friend's life. And from here, Johnny would try to settle down and marry Reina Higashikata. In doing so, he would move to Japan. He was finally beginning to find happiness again, but soon this happiness would crumble, as his wife would develop a horrible, unknown disease, which was slowly killing her. And in a desperate attempt to try to protect something that Johnny loved, he would steal the corpse parts from America and use them to cure his wife, but it only made the situation worse, as it transitioned to his son, and eventually, in an attempt to save his family, Johnny would then pass the curse on to himself. And it was assumedly this that caused the massive rock to come down and crush his head. Johnny lived a rather miserable life, from every moment of triumph being immediately followed up by a tragedy. His actions also ended up cursing his bloodline ever since him, sort of a reverse play on the person he gets his name from. And from here, we actually move on to someone who also grew up in a damaged environment and had a father who shaped them as a person. This being the bladed butterfly known as Jolyne Cujoh. Jolyne grew up with a mostly absent father, which resulted in her delinquent tendencies, as she did crimes and joined biker gangs to try to get her father's attention. But following this, she was set up for murder by people trying to hurt her father, so she was being punished for being connected to a man she didn't even get to live with. And while she was in jail, she reunites with the same estranged father, though her reunion with her father wouldn't last long, as eventually she would lose him twice actually, and then ultimately at the end of her story, she sacrifices herself for the greater good of the world, and then eventually ends up having her existence erased and replaced by someone else. Though, luckily, Irene gets to live a peaceful life in a new universe. Though the person that inadvertently made Jolyne's life worse wasn't too well off himself, this being Jotaro Kujo. Now, while Jotaro lived a pretty good life up until when he was 17, he was essentially drafted into a decades-long war from that point on, with an enemy and their minions, which eventually ended up ruining his life to the point that he never actually got a chance to retire. As he would constantly find himself fixing his family's problems or cleaning up Dio's loose ends, his reward for doing all this was to be killed protecting the daughter that he loved, and just like her, eventually he was erased from reality and replaced. Though the reason that I put Jotaro above Jolyne on the suffering scale is while his life was difficult, he got to live a decent amount of it on his own terms, earning not only a doctorate in a field that he enjoyed, but he also grew up with one of the most kind mothers out there, that being Holly. Now, no disrespect to Jolyne's mother, but Holly is just next level when it comes to moms. And speaking of someone who has a very close relationship with Holly, Josefumi Kujo is someone who I am counting as a JoJo for this list because his name can be shortened to JoJo, and that way we can have a Part 8 rep because the part isn't over yet. Now, Josefumi went through a lot. His mother, Kiyomi Kujo, nearly let him drown on purpose so that she could remove him from her life, and it's an action that he witnessed and caused him to develop a lot of abandonment issues, though he would be given a second chance at life when Holly Joestar Kira and Yoshikage Kira would save his life, and it's from here he would swear the same life that they saved to them, assisting them in their mission until, due to a run-in with some rock humans, him and Kira would end up buried underground and fusing together, which resulted in Gappy. So in a way, Josefumi was also erased and replaced, though in his case, his motivations live on through Gappy, who is working to finish what he started and save Holly Joestar Kira. And if we're discussing sacrificing oneself to save a family member, I think we need to talk about Jonathan Joestar, the honorable gentleman roots of the Joestar family tree. And while Jonathan's life was short, only living up to be about 20 years old, along with his life being plagued with grief and torment caused by Dio, he was still born into a rich family and even married the one he loved most. Along with this, Jonathan died a hero in his own eyes, clutching his evil brother's head in his arms, content with his end if it meant stopping Dio. And in death, Jonathan also provided for his future generations the tools needed to succeed when Dio escaped, due to his body sending out a distress signal and awakening stands within his descendants. From this point on, as of this video's release, this is the last JoJo to have died in their part, and because of that, everyone remaining on this list got off pretty good. Though, this is JoJo after all, and these good endings come with caveats of their own, meaning the order of who got off the best may change depending on your personal viewpoints on life and what makes a good life. So let's talk about the 3 remaining JoJos and what their good life got them. I'm gonna start with one of my personal favorites, the son of both Dio and technically Jonathan, Giorno Giovanna, originally known as Haruno Shiobana, who had a rough childhood to say the least, being neglected and beaten by his mother and stepfather, only to find peace through assisting a mobster in his time of need, resulting in Giorno idolizing the gangster life in a similar way that a child would idolize movie stars. And then he would use this idolization of the gangstar life to make his way through Passione and eventually evolve his stand into the terrifyingly powerful Gold Experience Requiem. And with this, he would dethrone Diavolo and take over in his place, though even with him being able to achieve his dream and become the gangstar he always thought himself as, along with essentially becoming the safest man on the planet, he got to this point through the death of some of his closest friends. And it was Giorno's mission that drove them to this point, which makes Giorno a great example of someone fulfilling their dreams, but at a great cost. As the saying goes, it is quite lonely at the top. But then we have Joseph Joestar, someone raised with essentially a silver spoon in their mouth, though this did come at the cost of him being raised by his grandmother and her friends, as his mother and father vanished from his life rather early. He turned out pretty well despite that, as while he went on many tough adventures and lost allies and arms, he would end up reuniting with his mother and would go on to master both Hamon and stands. Hell, he even defeated 4 immortal demigods, married a hot young Italian dit, and became one of the richest men in all of New York. The only thing Joseph has to worry about past part 3 is his own age, with Araki confirming that he was still alive in part 6, just senile, making him 91 years old, the longest living JoJo in the series. And it's easy to say that Joseph lived a rather full life, doing what he wanted, when he wanted, and who he wanted. But he ends up in the same spot that we all do at the end, in a failing body subject to the cruelty of time, which, depending on your views of life, can be rather terrifying. But maybe the ride is all that matters to you. And with that said, there's one more JoJo that you might be able to argue got off a little bit better than even Joseph himself, and he didn't experience a rich family upbringing. Instead, he grew up with a single mother trying her best. He also didn't have many friends before his part began. He seemingly kept to himself, but most importantly, he never knew his father. Yet he didn't grow up to be a delinquent, only looking like one. Instead, he managed to become one of the kindest stand users in the series, this being Josuke Higashikata, who, by the end of his part, was not only looking at the least amount of friendly casualties, with the main death being Shigechi and Aya, who one of them he didn't even know that well, but he also met and reunited with his father for a little bit, along with stopping Yoshikage Kira's reign of terror, but most importantly of all, the friends that he made during his adventure became lifelong pals like Okuyasu and Koichi. Along with this, given Araki's view on Morio and how he didn't want to return to it because he felt it had the perfect bookend, Josuke lives probably the most peaceful life in the series. And going even further beyond this, taking Thus Spoke Rohan Kishibe into account, the Higashikatas would find themselves coming into a lot of money, owning part of the reef which Rohan poaches with Tonio. And the only real negative thing you can say about Josuke's end is it's stagnant. His life probably hasn't changed much beyond the summer of 1999, resulting in him having stability without much excitement, which isn't inherently a bad thing, just depends on your view on life. So for those who had the best life, each of them had their own failings. Giorno achieved his goal, but lost a lot on his adventure. Joseph lived a long life, but is slowly becoming less of himself, and Josuke lives a stationary, peaceful one, meaning that not much happens in his life, which, to some, could be considered rather boring. For me, I rate these three in this order: Joseph, Josuke, Giorno. But that's only due to my personal bias. I like being able to actually reach one's dreams, and everywhere at the end of time terrifies me to the core. Though I imagine your placements are a little bit different. So please, feel free to tell me how you place these three characters at the end of your list. Now, while making this list, I found the most surprising thing is, while I knew there were a lot of JoJos that died, I didn't realize how many died in other characters' parts. Like how Part 6 and Part 8 both have 2 JoJo deaths. Which leaves me a little concerned about Gappy's possible future. Maybe Araki's going for 3. I certainly hope not. But even so, they all went out in ways that matches their characters perfectly. Be it Jotaro sacrificing himself to save the daughter that he's been trying to protect since she was born, or Jonathan living a short life but one that impacted and changed the next 120 years to come. But even then, we see from those who lived from their adventures didn't survive without losing something in the process. Araki is able to forge such bittersweet stories, and honestly, that's what makes JoJo so interesting. So hopefully this video was interesting to you, and if you want to see more videos like in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MetiNotTheBadGuy. Every pledge helps keep this channel flowing as smoothly as it does, and if you want to live a better life, you can do so by buying a copy of Shimonetta, A Boring World Where the Constant Dirty Jokes Doesn't Exist at buyshimonetta.com.